Have you ever stayed in a relationship longer than you should, thinking love could overcome everything? This story is about an elderly man who faced exactly that struggle. It's not just about a man and a woman. It's about the deeper fight for self-respect, dignity, and understanding that our worth should never depend on others' approval, especially as we age. As we grow older, there is often a temptation to prove ourselves. The fear of being alone or irrelevant may push us to hold on to relationships that no longer serve us. In his case, the man thought that by giving his all to the relationship, he would earn the love and respect he longed for. This is where his journey begins, at a place where hope and self-doubt mix together. When the man first met her, everything felt like a dream. It was as if he had been given a second chance at life. She seemed to offer the love he had been missing for so long. She showered him with compliments, making him feel valued and important. Her words were more than just flattering. They were like a warm light cutting through the darkness of his long years of self-doubt. For the first time in years, he felt seen, cherished, and even desirable again. She told him that his age brought a certain charm and wisdom that no younger man could match. She called him strong, capable, and wise, making him believe that his life, despite its many years, had been meaningful. Her words rekindled something inside him, a version of himself he had long forgotten. He started to see himself not as an aging man, but as someone worthy of love and admiration. Her affection felt genuine, and it consumed him. She made him feel alive, like he had something to offer again, something to be proud of. As the days passed, he became increasingly eager to keep her attention. He did everything to please her, treating her like royalty, as if her love was the greatest gift he could receive. He went above and beyond, thinking that by doing so he would make her see him as a man who deserved her affection. He became focused on keeping her happy, believing that this was the way to earn her love and keep the relationship alive. In his eyes, she wasn't just a woman. She was a symbol of vitality, youth, and a force that made him feel like he was truly living again. He became obsessed with proving himself, with doing everything right so she would see him for who he was, a man full of worth. The more he tried to please her, the more he sank into this belief that love had to be earned, that he needed to prove his value through actions. But little did he know, this journey was just beginning. Although everything seemed perfect at first, there was an underlying uncertainty he couldn't see yet. The story begins with hope and self-discovery, but it will soon reveal how love, when driven by insecurity and a need for approval, can slowly chip away at one's true sense of self. As time passed, the relationship, which had initially felt perfect, began to show subtle signs of wear. The cracks were small at first, just little things he could easily dismiss as misunderstandings or harmless quirks. But over time, these cracks grew wider, and the reality of the situation started to become undeniable. The once loving woman, who had made him feel strong, capable, and worthy, began to change in her words and actions. It started with her well-meaning suggestions, ones that sounded like advice but carried a hidden undercurrent of judgment. "You really should take better care of yourself," she said one day, her tone somewhat condescending, as if he were failing to live up to an unspoken standard. At first, he laughed it off, brushing it aside as just a small comment. But soon, these remarks became more frequent, each one cutting deeper. What had been simple concern now carried the weight of criticism, as if his age was a problem, something that made him less of a person in her eyes. Her words started to take on a more subtle form of superiority. She would remind him, casually at first, that he was too old for her. Each time she said it, it felt like a slap to his face, an unwelcome reminder that, despite all the affection he had felt, he was, in her eyes, past his prime. The man, once filled with confidence, began to feel small. He couldn't ignore the weight of her words anymore, and no matter how much he tried to justify them, they lingered, eating away at his self-esteem. He kept convincing himself that it was just a phase. Love, he thought, required patience, and everyone has rough patches in relationships. He told himself that these comments would pass, that things would go back to how they were before. But the comments didn't stop. They became more frequent and more cutting. What started as small criticisms about his health and his age grew into a constant stream of reminders that she was younger, fitter, and more vibrant than he was. He no longer felt like the strong, capable man he once thought he was. He started to feel invisible to her, as if his value had been reduced to nothing more than his age and how much he could keep up with her. Then came the harshest blow. During intimate moments, she criticized his performance, comparing him to younger men in a way that shattered the last pieces of his confidence. "You're slow," she said one night. Her words were sharp, cutting through him in ways that left him breathless with pain. His identity as a man, a lover, someone worthy of affection, was now under attack. But even in the face of these cruel words, she would throw him just enough praise to keep him hooked. She would tell him that no one else could love her as he did, that his tenderness was something rare. Yet the mockery was never far behind. She made him feel desperate, like he had to prove himself more and more. But he couldn't see it for what it was: manipulation. He thought that if he could just do better, if he could just try harder, she would see his worth. He didn't want to admit that he had lost himself, that he had given up pieces of who he was just to keep someone who couldn't truly value him. This stage of the relationship was marked by emotional erosion, slowly but surely wearing away at his sense of self. And yet he stayed, believing that love required sacrifice, that the more he gave, the more she would eventually appreciate him. But as the days wore on, he couldn't deny it any longer. The cracks were no longer small. They were opening wide, threatening to break everything apart. The cracks in the relationship grew deeper, and the man's once unwavering belief in the power of love began to erode. He had convinced himself that love required sacrifice, that in order to maintain it, he needed to endure the pain, the criticisms, and the emotional toll. But as time passed, the weight of her words and actions became too much to bear. He could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. His self-worth, once strong and vibrant, began to crumble under the constant barrage of judgment. She had made him feel strong and desirable in the beginning, but now her words only reminded him of his age, his shortcomings, and his inadequacy. He started to see himself through her eyes, and in doing so, he lost sight of the man he used to be. He had become desperate to prove himself, constantly seeking validation from someone who could not or would not see his true worth. The more he tried to please her, the further he drifted away from himself. The emotional toll was immense. The man, once confident and self-assured, had become a shell of the person he was. He had lost his sense of identity, his confidence, and his dignity. Each time she criticized him, he felt smaller, less valuable, as though he had nothing left to offer. The relationship had begun to take more than it gave, and the man was left feeling drained, exhausted, and invisible. The turning point came one evening, after another argument that left him feeling empty and broken. For the first time, he could no longer ignore the inner voice that had been speaking to him all along. Standing in front of the mirror, he looked at himself, really looked at himself, and saw the truth for the first time in years. He saw a 70-year-old man, not a failure, but a man who had lived, loved, and learned. He saw the lines on his face as symbols of experience and wisdom, not as signs of aging or decline. He realized that he had been shrinking himself to fit into a relationship that wasn't valuing him for who he truly was. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He understood that self-love was not just important, it was essential. He couldn't keep sacrificing his dignity, his worth, just to hold on to a relationship that was slowly destroying him. The love he thought he had was no longer enough to fill the emptiness he felt inside. He needed to find a way back to himself, to reclaim his identity, and to rediscover his self-respect. For the first time in years, he found the courage to face the painful truth. He realized that true love could never come at the expense of self-respect. He couldn't continue to endure the emotional abuse, the constant undermining of his worth, just for the hope that things might improve. It was time to make a change, no matter how hard it would be. In that moment of clarity, he knew what he had to do. He had to let go. The relationship had run its course, and in doing so he would not only walk away from her, but he would walk toward himself. This was the beginning of his journey back to self-respect, a journey that would require immense strength and courage, but one that he was ready to take. The decision to walk away was not easy for the man. It was, in fact, one of the hardest things he had ever done. But by this point in the relationship, he had reached a profound realization. His dignity and self-respect could no longer be sacrificed for the sake of someone who refused to truly appreciate him. He understood, at last, that true love was not about enduring pain, humiliation, or compromise. Love should lift us up, not break us down. His heart ached as he thought of the time and energy he had invested in the relationship, but the pain of staying had become unbearable. One evening, after yet another heated argument that left him feeling small and insignificant, he knew the time had come. He found himself in his room, alone, reflecting deeply on everything he had endured. The insults, the constant belittling, the comparisons to younger men, they had all taken their toll. But in the quiet of that moment, he realized something crucial. He had given so much of himself that he had lost his sense of who he truly was. He couldn't continue down that path. He needed to reclaim his self-worth, and to do that, he had to leave. The next day, with a mixture of dread and determination, he sat down to talk to her. For the first time in a long while, he was calm. There was no anger in his voice, no desperation. He simply told her how he felt. He explained that the relationship, once full of hope and affection, had eroded his confidence and dignity. Her criticisms had chipped away at him until he barely recognized the man he once was. He had been patient, he had sacrificed, but now he understood that he could no longer keep pretending everything was fine. He had to walk away. He told her, with quiet strength, that love should never come at the expense of his self-respect. No matter how much he had cared for her, he couldn't stay in a relationship that made him feel invisible and unworthy. He wasn't asking for her approval or forgiveness. He was simply asserting that his self-worth was non-negotiable. Her reaction was exactly what he expected. She dismissed his words as overreactions, as dramatics. She tried to minimize his feelings, calling him too sensitive or saying he was just going through a phase. But he didn't waver. For the first time, he stood firm in his decision, grounded not in anger or bitterness, but in the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own value. The conversation was painful, but it was liberating. The man felt a mix of emotions as he walked out of the house. There was sorrow, yes, a sadness that he was letting go of someone he had loved, someone who had once made him feel alive. But there was also a sense of relief, a heavy weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he could breathe freely. The burden of trying to prove himself, of earning love through sacrifice, had been lifted. Walking away was not just about ending the relationship. It was about walking toward himself, toward the man he had almost forgotten, the man who was worthy of love and respect. And in that moment, he knew that this was the first step in his journey back to dignity and self-respect. It was terrifying, but it was necessary. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where he would no longer allow anyone to define his worth but himself. After the breakup, the man found himself facing a new challenge: loneliness. It wasn't the kind of loneliness he had experienced before, though. This time, it wasn't a hollow ache caused by feeling unwanted or unappreciated. It was a dignified solitude, a space where he could finally breathe and begin to rediscover who he truly was. He realized that the relationship had not only drained him emotionally, but it had also caused him to lose touch with himself. Now, as he walked away from that toxic relationship, he was walking toward a new beginning, the chance to reconnect with his true identity. The initial days were tough. He missed the companionship, the shared moments, and even the simple presence of someone else in the house. Nights felt longer, and the silence in the home was deafening. Yet, despite the discomfort, something changed within him. This loneliness, unlike before, felt different. It wasn't a sign of failure or abandonment, but rather an opportunity for reflection and growth. It was a chance to finally reclaim the pieces of himself that had been buried under the weight of someone else's expectations and criticisms. As the days turned into weeks, he started to realize how much he had neglected himself over the years. He reached out to old friends, people who had known him before the relationship consumed him. He reconnected with his past, remembering the man he had been, strong, vibrant, and full of life. He began to pick up old hobbies he had abandoned, rediscovering passions that had once brought him joy. Little by little, he started to build himself back up. He began to understand that his value didn't depend on the approval of others. It had always been within him. He had simply lost sight of it while trying to fit into someone else's vision of who he should be. The more time he spent alone, the more he realized that the love he had been seeking from someone else had to start with loving himself. Self-love wasn't just about caring for his physical needs. It was about embracing his flaws, his past, and his wisdom. It was about accepting himself as he was, without needing to prove anything to anyone. One day, while standing in front of the mirror, he saw a different reflection. He no longer saw a man defined by his age or his wrinkles. Instead, he saw someone who had survived, loved deeply, and learned valuable lessons. His gray hair wasn't a symbol of decline. It was a testament to the wisdom he had earned over the years. Each wrinkle told a story of triumph, struggle, and resilience. He wasn't just an aging man. He was a man who had lived fully, and he had every right to be proud of that. As time passed, he started to embrace aging, not as a loss, but as a gift. Society often glorifies youth, placing it on a pedestal as the ultimate standard of beauty and vitality. But he understood now that the marks of time, wrinkles, gray hair, and a slower pace of life, were badges of honor. They represented a life lived with depth, experience, and understanding. He no longer felt the need to chase the fleeting energy of youth. Instead, he began to appreciate the wisdom that came with age and the strength that had carried him through a lifetime of experiences. He also learned that being alone didn't mean being lonely. Solitude became his sanctuary, a place where he could reflect, heal, and grow. He realized that in the quiet moments of being alone, he had the opportunity to rediscover the parts of himself that had been buried for so long. Through this process, he found a new sense of peace, a peace that came from accepting himself for who he was and not seeking validation from others. In the end, he came to understand that true love starts with loving yourself. He had spent so much time trying to prove his worth to someone else, but now he knew that his worth had always been within him. He didn't need anyone else's approval to feel valuable. This newfound self-respect, this peace, was worth more than anything else he had ever sought. He had learned that walking away from a toxic relationship wasn't a failure. It was a step toward freedom, toward embracing his true self.